Hey there.
Yeah, Alex, how's it going?
Yeah, good. I just have a case of the hiccups, so I've been like hiccuping for the last 10
Oh
minutes.
no.
Yeah, I have some tea, so I'm gonna drink on that. How are you today?
I'm doing okay. A little early in the morning.
Like physically, where were you located, if you don't mind asking?
I'm in the Bay Area,
Oh,
so in Pacifica specifically.
gotcha. So you've been feeling those rains that we've got
Oh
recently.
yeah, it's very nice actually. It doesn't rain very often.
Yeah, I like the rain too, but like I have this dog that will not like when it rains, he looks at me as if it's my fault. He does really like the rain, yeah.
Why you gotta make walks harder?
I know, Max. I'm so mean to him. I make it rain and like cold, and he has to like wear his like cute little waterproof vest that he hates.
Uh, what kind of dog do you have, Alex?
Oh, he's a little terrier Chihuahua. He's 25 pounds or 27.
Mm.
Uh, there's a lot of terrier in him. Like
Not
it's like
that small if it's 25 pounds.
he's not that small, but like he's
Mm.
still like you can pick him up, right? Put him under
Yeah,
your shoulder.
yeah.
Um,
My dog is like 20 pounds,
oh
but
yeah,
he's like taller.
gotcha. Yeah, he's a little. What kind of dog do you have?
He's like a mix, like 20 different breeds.
Hmm.
We thought he was like a more like long-haired Chihuahua, but he's like we did his DNA. It was only like 3% of it.
Hmm.
Um, let me see if I can put the picture.
Hello.
Here we go.
Hey,
Hello.
today is my policy day. Everything's related.
Can't get away from policy.
I went to the policy working group.
Oh, how was it?
I can give an update later when y'all are.
Could
Oh.
you also explain what is that?
Huh?
Sorry, I don't know. Could you also explain what is that? I don't know.
Yes,
Sorry.
absolutely.
Was that like earlier today?
Yeah, it's at 8. I know.
Oh no.
That's
Like
why
always?
that's why normally I haven't been there. But you know, this was one of the things that came out from KubeCon, to one, understand what the working group is doing. So, okay, so let me just start with what is a working group. The working groups are basically like a subgroup of folks who want to who have like a point in a special topic that they want to work together on. And the working group is supposed to be short, right? Meaning the working group is to do X, and then once you're done, the working group disbands, right? So the policy working group has been around since, I don't know, as long as I've worked on this project. So it's been a long time. So at KubeCon, when we had the like meet and greet between all the SIG folks, I saw Jim, who is one of the co-chairs for the working group, and the policy working group is actually a subgroup under SIGAuth. So we asked him like, hey, you know, the working group hasn't given an update for what the working group is working on and what is the status of that to SIGAuth in like over a year or maybe even more. So that's why I went today, just to understand what the working group is working on. Yeah, that was a lot. Anyway, so I can give a quick update. I also put it in the put that on Slack in case folks can't join this. But basically, hold on. So there is a Slack channel for the working group. There's a working group policy prototypes repo under Kubernetes 6. So usually working groups don't own code, right? Usually working groups is just a bunch of folks who come up with a design or consolidate on something. But today in there, you can look at their meeting notes. Hold on, let me share it here. And I'm just talking while we wait, so feel free to tell me to stop talking. Policy working group. So I put it in the meeting agenda. So that was their the meeting notes basically. But the TLDR is there's another project called Polaris. I haven't heard it before, but maybe y'all have. It's another policy engine. It's another webhook. It's pretty interesting in that I like their dashboard. Again, I didn't look far enough. I just kind of looked at the demo that they showed today in the meeting. So if you have time, feel free to look at it. But yeah, and then we talked about, the chairs for the working group should give us an update on what they're working on. And then we talked a little bit about the cell cap, and like most people don't even know what it is, and how the working group should actually work together to figure out a good user experience once that cap is reaches beta. That's sort of my opinion. And then looks like there is a Kubernetes governance white paper that folks in this working group is working on. So something to look at, I guess. And then another thing is the policy, the policy report CRD. So if you look at this guy, and I created an issue for it as well. Let me put it here, I guess. So if you look at the repo, right, today looks like there's Falco, there's Kubebench, there's KubeArmor, and Offscale. I don't know what that is, but Trivi, they all have an adapter, so it looks like they all write their violations to this policy report CR custom resource. So I created an issue just for us to start evaluating it. I know we looked at this like at the very beginning when this was proposed, but given that there's more adoption, I think it's good for us to at least evaluate it, look at what it offers today. If there are gaps, let's give the working group some feedback. If it works really well, then we should just add ourselves.
I mean, so if it works really well, that's kind of a concerning thing to hear for me, because I see working really well as very conditional, right? Like if it's a small cluster, it'll work really well. If it's a large cluster with a lot of violations, it might not, right? Like.
And when I say it works well, I do mean for like production and large scale, like the way we would evaluate our own features, right?
Gotcha.
But I think either way is I want to like at least document the findings, because we looked at it in the past when it was, we didn't look at it deeply and we didn't document the gaps, at least not in an issue, right?
I think before we try poking at it, we should see what art we have out there around use of etcd and how that has fallen over in the past.
Yeah.
Like, is it config maps or events that have special storage backends? There might be other examples. Like, if nothing else, that would inform us like what sorts of problems people have seen and what kind of solutions.
Absolutely. And I think that should be all, the questions and the findings should be part of that issue that I've created. So I'll move this up then.
Rita, did you get a chance to ask about the sharding?
I did not, because the meeting had a lot of different things. So I think we should just do that as part of the evaluation.
Because I was looking at it and I was talking to Jacob about it. I don't think they have it.
There's no sharding, so it's just a giant CR.
That's my understanding was when I was looking at the YAML files.
Gotcha. Okay, but again, let's follow up on this in the actual evaluation. And I know maybe it's still the case or maybe it's not, but either way, let's just document it because we haven't done that in the past.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, perhaps we can propose sharding.
Yeah, for sure, we could.
If they don't have it already. I might have missed it, I don't know.
Right. Sounds good.
And whether sharding is even sufficient. Like, yeah, I agree. It seems like minimally necessary, but
Yeah. Totally. Okay, any other questions about this before we move on to something else? All right. What's next? Caching external data per audit run. Yes. Sorry, I'm just trying to.
I can get this started if you want me to.
Oh, I think this was one of the optimizations that we talked about for external data.
Yep.
I know we talked about like the providers should be caching. So this is not that, right? This is how Gatekeeper caches the response. So that, the proposal here is so that every audit run would just make one request if it's the same signature, right? Same object that we're evaluating. And
yeah, and
go ahead.
I'm curious, like, I've been trying to figure out like how this could work essentially, right? Both for audit run and for admission requests. And I haven't put a lot of thought in it, so I don't think I have like a tautology of possibilities, but one interesting approach might be, and I don't know if this is possible, but to basically decorate the calls to this cache access function with a unique session key, right? And then you would update the Golang backing the cache function to say if session key recognized, access that cache, otherwise create cache. Then look for a cache hit, do normal caching things. And when the session key gets torn down, basically at the end of audit or the webhook, delete that cache. One, I don't know if that's possible, right? In terms of like decorating these things, like you could require the user to inject that context, but that seems not ideal. And the other thing I'm thinking about is we'd want to have some way of managing memory usage potentially, right? Like if you had a lot of parallel web requests and a lot of like high information content, external data responses, that could be an issue. It sort of has a natural cap in terms of the number of parallel, if users have set the max serving threads, right? In audit, you'll only ever have one session at a time. So maybe it's a non-issue, but that's one risk with that approach.
Quick question. So let's talk about audit first, because I think that's a more obvious one. Well, didn't we say that we just want to cache per run? So essentially, like the cache is only gonna be valid during the one audit run, right? So why do we still need a session? Why do we still need to?
The session key would identify the run, right? Like you would create a session at the start of the run.
Right, but aren't we clearing out the cache after the run completes?
Right. So then you would just say end of session and the cache would clean up.
Yeah, they could manually clean up, like delete the entire thing. And then the session ID could be like the audit timestamp or something like that.
Yeah, like the session key just needs to be unique
Right.
because remember, is this true? Yes, audit and webhook could be sharing the same executor and the same like caching structure if you're running it all as like a monolithic process.
But how do we define a session there? Because audit, we have a clear session, right? Per audit run is a session. But how do we define a session that ties into the webhook?
Per webhook call.
But that would be different than the audit one.
Right. So basically what the model would be at a high level would be there's just some arbitrary start session code, right? Where you call it and it returns a unique key. And then every time you provide that key to the external data function, it accesses the associated cache. And then you call end session or, defer. you add a defer call when you open the session to close the session, kind of like context. And when it does that, that's a signal, hey, this cache is no longer relevant, destroy it. And so for audit, that would look like you would create a key at the start of the audit loop and destroy it at the end. For webhook, you would create the key at the start of, like, before the first time we call the constraint framework and destroy it at the end of that function.
It sounds a lot like how we're writing to disk right now for audit. It's the same logic. Because for writing disk, we also use like the audit start time or something as the.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily use timestamps. Like timestamp could be like if we just did audit, a cheap way to get a unique key for audit. But it doesn't help with webhook, right? Like we could just create a UUID. Which
yeah, totally. Yeah, it's
Same.
easier.
What's it?
It's easier. Yeah, I mean, I think the key we can figure it out that's like a very minor detail that I think we could just hash it out in a PR or something. But like I think what like Surtash and I were talking about this is for audit, I think it's pretty obvious that the cache will help, right? Whereas for the webhook, I think that's where it's hard, like the benefit is not as obvious because for a given pod, right, for or so like, let's say whatever the resource you're validating, you could potentially save the cache could help if there are multiple containers call the same provider to get the same response, but that seems less likely, right? So what would be a good example? What would be like a good use case where the cache actually helps here?
I think for webhook, it'll be the replicas. Right, a high number of replicas.
Yeah, but then remember, it's your constraint is at the pod level, right?
What's so before we get into that, what makes audit likely to benefit from cache?
Because for the audit for a given run, you're looking at the whole cluster, right? So let's say let's say if the policy is looking at the pod level and you have thousands of pod on the cluster, then there's no reason why you have to keep calling the same provider over and over.
Except, and let's just take the convert image tags to hashes one. So right now, what that execution flow is going to look like for audit is going to scrape all of the pods and whatever else on the cluster, right? And then per resource it finds, it's going to call external data, and that's going to only have a cache hit if it's seen the same image before. So you do get some like deduplication per like deployment. What's that?
Per constraint.
Well, no, per deployment replica, because it's not per constraint. So if I have 2 deployments, right, each with 10 pods associated with it.
Yeah. I just meant, anyway, yeah, I think we're saying the same thing. Yeah.
Okay, well, just to be clear, it's not per constraint. It's not gated by the constraint. It's gated by the uniqueness of the resources.
It's the resource, Yeah. Sorry, I misspoke. Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. You were up at 8. Okay, so webhook. Yeah, that's fair.
So I think there's like very obvious benefit that this cache could provide for audit, such that you don't need to make the provider call over and over. But for a admission request, that's not as obvious.
Admission request is harder for validation. Mutation, because there's the potential for multiple calls. I'm forgetting if we resolve at the end of the convergence or not. If we resolve at the end of the convergence, not as much of an issue because we're all patching it out anyway, for sure. I guess more though, when I'm thinking about this, the hard part is implementing it at all, right? Like figuring out how to get some kind of situational caching going on, right? Like, hey, this audit run, I guess if you, so if you only have it for audit, right? One benefit is we know audit only ever runs as a singleton, so we could just like create cache, flush cache, create
That's
cache.
what I was thinking. Yeah.
But then we also need to handle the case where audit and webhook are running in the same process, just because that's how the user had configured it. So we would need to.
But our recommendation is that they run as separate pods, right? So
it is a recommendation, but like it's not a requirement, right? Like it's just our default.
Sure.
It still might be easier though. We would then, instead of needing like the session thing, we would just need some kind of like conditional metadata right? That says, hey, this is running in an audit context versus a webhook context.
Yeah.
And that might be easier in the sense that that's not dynamic data, right? So that would still be like solving some kind of data passing or creating two instances of the engine, right? But that two instances of the engine solution is unique to that scenario, right? Like you couldn't get away with two instances of the engine for the webhook. You'd need n instances, where n is the maximum number of webhook threads.
I guess I'm still not convinced we need it for the webhook.
Yeah. I'm just comparing like the relative, like how hard I would expect it to be to write. Like, do we get any simplification by assuming no cache for the webhook?
Oh, yes.
You still say yes?
I think so. If you're looking at just audit, then it's a lot simpler. If you're talking about a shared cache between webhook and audit, it's way more complicated.
Well, to be clear, not a shared cache, right? You never want to be accessing the same data set, right? So the question would be, we either would need to create a unique cache just for audit,
Okay.
or create a unique cache for audit plus one per webhook thread, right? And
Sure.
either of those two solutions of creating like n different copies of the Rego engine or using this cache key, they kind of reduce to that same problem. So the question is, if you can ignore the n webhook threads, but still have a unique cache for audit, does that simplify the code? I don't know, to be honest. It's a possibility. So yeah, it's worth leaving it open, I guess, for someone who, because the unknown here is, has anyone like looked at the code and figured out how we would do caching just generally?
I started looking at the audit one, like how we would do it for audit. I was planning on writing like a proposal for how we want to do it. But before that, I want to come back to this team and say, hey, are there like actual good use cases of having this cache for webhooks, webhook requests? Because if not, then we don't need to carry that.
I mean, I think the audit is definitely easier and like more priority. But I think in the webhook case would be the replicas. No, still like, because like say we are saying have Nginx and then have like 1,000 Nginx replicas. Each pod in that will have to go through admission.
Yeah, but that's still every pod is one request. And if we're saying the cache is good for one request, it doesn't help in this case.
Yeah, go ahead, Max.
Expansion templates, you're not going to get an n reduction, but you will get, well, actually you might, you'll get at least a halving of the number of calls, because you would otherwise call it once for the deployment and once for the expanded pod. If you had like 50 expansion templates, which I don't think it would scale like that, it's it seems a counterintuitive use case, but I guess you would get 1/50 number of calls.
Could we maybe combine this with the expansion to maybe do like a one call per deployment?
I don't think we want to necessarily assume that the expansion template,
because we know that the pods are going to be the same, right? From the expansion template, like
but so what does it? I think that's just starting to look like a cache, though, right? Because what's going to happen is expansion template infers pod, right? And then you run pod through admission. And I don't know, like, what do we rewrite the rego? Or if not, we have
It's
to
the
like
same.
store the response, and that's a
Yeah.
cache.
Right. So I was thinking like maybe if it comes through the expansion template, then we can use that as the cache.
Sure.
Because we know the mechanism, right? There's like a higher level thing, and then we can use that thing to say like, hey, this is going to be the cache.
But then we haven't sidestepped that issue of having a separate cache for per webhook, which is fine. But then like, if we've solved that, we may as well just like cache it, just to take advantage. Like the other place where there's an advantage here is if the rego is poorly written, right? Such that they're calling external data 50 times per request, or sorry, per validation. It's not clear to me how you necessarily avoid that, other than like specifically writing your rego to batch it, but rego's not really intended to be like a imperative language, right? So call order isn't really built into the syntax so much. So there could be a benefit there as well. Sorry, I got distracted by that other point. But the first point was, if we're solving the problem of injecting that data for resource expansion, then we've effectively put it on ourselves to solve the multiple cache problem anyway.
And just to clarify, that is for a cache for per validation request.
Yes. Per webhook validation request, not
yeah. I mean validation webhook, right? Yeah. Yes. Webhook validation request. But I mean, I see the point of having if you have the expansion thing, then you could leverage this, but at the end of the day, even if you're using expansion, the actual validation request is still at the pod level. Right?
Even if you have an expansion. Oh, that's fair. That's fair.
So I'm still not seeing the value this cache would add.
So
other than the bad rego, I guess.
Yeah. Bad rego is convincing to me. Multiple expansions. If you had multiple expansions, that could add value. The question of whether you actually get multiple expansions in the wilds, that's more questionable to me. Like I'm fine with the idea of starting out just audit just to see how it works. But
that's what I wanted out of this discussion is, are we okay with just doing
I think that's like the easy one. Yeah.
Okay.
The but on that is we need to assume the audit and the webhook can run on the same process.
Yes.
Just so we're not breaking those users who have done that.
I mean, we can add the cache in the frameworks, the external data function, and then cache it there per, like, I guess, run. But yeah, it's like you said, how do we align those ones? Yeah, it's a little.
Yeah. Let me think about this. I think what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is we want to start with audit, but it should be designed that if we decide to add it for webhook in the future, it's possible, right? Like we don't want to lock into just for audit.
I mean, I'm kind of fine with, because in my view, this should be invisible to the user.
Yeah.
Invisible.
It's on our side. I think it's all in the background, so we can change it. So there's plugins.
But the risk I see is, again, if you run audit and webhook in the same process, like that I think does impact. It makes it a harder problem, potentially.
I mean, could we say this is not supported in that scenario?
What's a
And then
harder
just have the
problem?
flag disable caching.
Why is this a harder problem if it's running in the same pod?
Because
Same
we
deployment?
currently we have a shared constraint framework instance between audit and the webhook, right? And so if you're running audit and webhook, not just in the same pod as like sidecars, but in the same process,
Mhm.
and you have this cache, writing the cache in such a way that it only applies to the audit side of things and not to the webhook side of things is a little bit harder than if you could just assume, oh, you only have one caller and it's audit, because then you could just have the cache and wipe it. I think Certesh, that's an interesting like out here of
I mean,
say
we could
don't
just check the
support
flag,
it.
right? Hey, if operation audit and webhook specified at the same thing, we say, oh, this you cannot use this caching. We just
Yeah,
disable it.
and then just have like a disable cache flag.
Right. I mean, we don't even recommend using it like that, so I don't think we need to specifically go out of our way to support that.
Right. Well, we just need to not provide regressions to
Right.
people.
Yeah. As long as we can opt out of it, like we don't have to use this cache, then it's all good.
Yeah. But it's, I think, still worth it if it like becomes apparent. There's like a relatively easy way to segregate these caching mechanisms, right? Have cached here but not cached there. Definitely call that out, because it's not useless, and that would be something we could build on later if necessary.
Okay,
I'm
let me
saying not
think about
MVP,
this.
but keep an eye out for it.
Yeah,
What's
yeah,
that?
yeah. Let me think about this. I mean, I was also thinking of creating the cache just in like the audit controller, but like then then you are definitely keeping it just for audit.
Wouldn't it need to be in the frameworks? Because we
Mm,
call external data in frameworks. That's like a Go function.
It would need to live, it would need to be accessible from frameworks. But honestly, if you could create the cache at the caller level and figure out a way to inject it into frameworks,
yeah,
that's problem solved.
yeah,
Right.
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah,
That way,
it'll be easier to do it in the
but
framework.
that's why I wanted to confirm, because that's locked in. This is only for audits.
Well, but then we could use the same mechanism for
Sure, for
webhooks
webhook. Okay.
later. And we just like,
I think I'll probably start that there, and unless I'm blocked, and then maybe I'll look at the external data thing instead.
I mean,
But I
wouldn't it
was
be
planning
much
on
easier to
starting
do
with
it in the
the
frameworks? Because we call the things over there, and then we literally call the external data there. It's defined there.
because the controller has the concept of it per run, right? So I would know exactly when to start the cache, when to kill the cache. That is not something the framework would know. I mean,
I see.
yeah.
I don't want to discourage this like approach, because honestly, it like is a more full featured thing if you could get it to work. So
I mean,
definitely
at the framework level.
well, to what you were suggesting, the
At the audit level,
the cache from the caller is
Yeah.
more full featured, because it like trivializes everything I was talking about, as long as it's not like shared across
Yeah.
calls.
That's what I was thinking.
Right. I do think that Certesh has a point of, if that turns out to be intractable, and you build the cache into the framework and you add some kind of handle that says flush cache, right? Like in constructing this external data function, it passes just like a function that flushes the cache, let's say, so we don't affect the constraint framework interface. You could just call that at the end of every audit, and that would solve that as well.
Yeah.
and you wouldn't need to figure out the injection story.
Right. Okay, let me let me look into it. But this was great. It helps me think about the options. Okay, thank you, everybody. Anyone else has comments here before we move to the next topic? Just time conscious. Yeah. Okay, if not, let's move to the next topic. Sartash.
Sorry, I was on mute. Let me paste the issue. I think we heard from several folks that they wanted like a constraint level process exclusion. And I'm just seeing Max's comment, by the way. So I thought maybe we could want to do some sort of similar thing we wanted to do with the config resource, as in like per constraint, we want to just do audit exclusion or webhook exclusion, or we could do like on a namespace level or on the namespace selector. I thought this might be enable folks to say, hey, this constraint only applies to like audit, for example.
So there's a couple of things to unpack there for that specific idea. For the process exclusion for namespace selector, the one issue with that is referential data, where right now, the reason why we do namespace name and we don't have label selectors is that currently the only way we have to handle, hey, this set of things we should cache has changed, is to wipe all of the referential data cache and repopulate it. And if you had something like a namespace selector, what would need to happen is every time you updated a namespace, if the labels had changed, you would need to wipe the cache. So currently the behavior is updating the config, which is a singleton object, has the risk of wiping the cache, which is not ideal, but at least like, isolated. Whereas like we wanted to have namespace selectors for a while, but updating namespaces wiping the cache, that might be like a bridge too far, right? Like the cache would just be wiped too often if there's some workloads that are constantly like creating namespaces or updating them.
One
sorry
question. Go ahead, Greta.
Sorry, just to clarify, and this is possibly where Sartash, your suggestion is not at the config resource, right? Your suggestion is at the constraint level.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, but Max is talking about config.
Okay, I heard you saying that you wanted to update the config resource so you can create this exemption for. Okay, sorry.
No, I meant this in the constraint. So today we have the excluded namespaces there. So we would make it similar to the config resource. So I was comparing with the config resource. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's because the comment didn't explicitly say this proposal is for constraints.
I see. Okay. It does say disable audit for constraint in the title, but yeah, that makes sense. So it would basically, instead of so today we have excluded namespaces in an array, right? We would have like this keyed list basically with excluded namespaces and coupled with the processes.
Yeah, and I would like my one like thought here is this is less about one of my key thoughts about how I'm conceptualizing the problem is this is less about processes and more about enforcement points, right? And the reason I make that distinction is things like gator test, or yes, gator test, that's the right one, where it's not technically another process in Gatekeeper, but still I think relevant to this discussion. Right? Like I could imagine users either wanting to be more or less inclusive in Gator test of like if it's running on, say you have a VS Code plugin, right, that runs Gator test every time you save or something. you might want to disable external data constraints for that plugin because users don't necessarily have access to those endpoints or something. Whereas you definitely want it running in webhook and audit. So that basically, I'm sort of expanding the scope of where I see this relevant. I don't think that changes necessarily the shape of the solution, right? Like I think anything that doesn't exclude would work there. But what might change the shape of the solution would be if we also wanted to address having different enforcement actions per enforcement point, right? So let's say you have a new policy and you want to roll it out gradually, right? First step, dry run for sure. Next step would be warn at the webhook level, because you don't, enforce at the webhook level is the most production risky thing you could do. But maybe you step it up to deny for audit. And maybe if you have a shift left thing with Gator test, you also step it up to deny there. Because you're giving users that strong signal of, no, seriously, you cannot add this config anymore. We're turning on the policy. Like, we won't break what you currently have, but don't make the like legacy problem worse. So you wind up with either two constraints in this model where you could toggle it on and off per enforcement point. You either have two constraints, one at warn and one at deny, right? And the warn only is active for the webhook, and the deny is only active for, or the deny is active everywhere else, essentially. Or if you had a mechanism where you could target enforcement actions per enforcement point, that would be able to hit both issues with one constraint.
One thought, how today we just expect one enforcement action per constraint. What if we actually accept multiple?
Yeah.
That would solve this problem, right?
Yeah, and I think even multiple enforcement actions per constraint 100%, and multiple enforcement actions per enforcement point. So you could imagine too, in a world where we had messaging queues, right? And some of them were tied to alert, some of them weren't. You could have an enforcement action that pushes a violation to a message queue. And so you would have, in the case of like a webhook deny, two actions taken, like deny, but also push it to the team's message queue so that the user gets a message, hey, your request didn't go through. And in case you weren't like looking at the output to kubectl apply, because maybe you can't because it's a a shift left thing, you still get that notification of, here was your violation.
Yeah. I think multiple enforcement action is needed at the constraint level, so you could have multiple, but then it still doesn't solve the namespace issue, right? Because currently it's all or nothing, right? So either you exclude the namespace from all action or not. But sounds like the use case here is users want to exempt certain namespaces from certain actions.
Right. But can we
Wait,
do both?
Is it namespace or constraint?
Namespaces. So the constraint is still valid for most namespaces except some of the namespaces.
But then what's the per constraint bit? Because the one I saw, they basically were like, hey, I don't want this thing to even run in audit because it's
so
expensive.
that's the
Right.
at the constraint level, right? If today everybody just opts into audit, but people want a way to say, I just want webhook, not audit.
Yeah. I think people also want to do that to save resources. So they have a constraint, they just want to run it on webhook. So they don't want audit to do the audit things, right? So why not just let it run on webhook?
Yeah. Okay. So 100%. This seems like per constraint stuff. Constraint exists or has different behavior depending on the context.
Yeah.
Where is namespace coming in?
The namespace comes in this issue, right? Is say production namespace. They only want webhook but not audit. But for other namespaces, they want both webhook and audit, for example.
And I can understand that for like if they want
I
to
can
save
see that
resources.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it kind of covers it in the sense of you could use namespace selectors. You would need 2 constraints to do that, though. So they want to have a different enforcement action per names. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and this is not the constraint thing. Like they don't want to have differing actions taken, or they don't want to exclude a constraint from an operation. They want to have a
Right.
different.
There are 2 different requirements. One is at the constraint level. So global to the constraint for all namespaces. And then another requirement is I want different actions for different namespaces.
Yeah. So the multiple constraints, that's covered. That would cover that. But then the question would be.
Oh, you mean it's covered today if you just create multiple constraints?
Yeah.
I haven't
Was it?
I haven't tried that. So you're saying I could have the same constraint, sorry, just 2 different constraints with different actions?
Yeah. And you could have like one be the mirror image of the other. If you had a namespace selector, you could say and create this like is special namespace label. The deny one can be if not special namespace and in its label selector, and the warn one could be if special namespace, and you're always guaranteed to get coverage, but you can shift the namespace.
Right, except everybody defaults to audit. That's the missing piece. You can't opt out of audit.
You can't opt out of audit.
We always do audit.
Oh, so you want to that's fair. So what you could do then is you could have for the one that does the deny, that one is opted out of audit. And
why is it opt out of audit?
Okay, sorry. Let me backtrack a little bit. Let's live in a world where we have multiple enforcement actions per constraint, but we do not have anything about the namespace primitives other than what we have today. We have one constraint that is webhook only, right? In the sense that it's deny for webhook, and then we have another like default enforcement action that's like do nothing. Like this constraint shouldn't be called if you can avoid it. Right. So it's deny for webhook, do nothing else. And you have another constraint that is warn or do nothing for webhook, right? And deny for audit. And what you would have is if, unless special namespace, call the deny webhook constraint, and then and then everything else gets this constraint. Not everything else, right? Everything gets this other constraint, right? So everything gets audited at the same severity, but the special namespace is excluded from the webhook.
Okay, but all this is with the assumption that we now have an audit action, right? That doesn't exist today.
That you have, so audit would be an enforcement point, right? So in this model, you would have, let's pretend the strawman design, you had enough information where you could say, for enforcement point X, take these 7 actions or whatever. For enforcement point Y, take these 3 actions. Everything else, do no action, right? And that would be the mechanism to get that prerequisite of you have your webhook only constraint and your audit constraint. And then which action was taken by webhook versus audit doesn't matter. And if you wanted to have a different severity of audit, you could. You just need 3 constraints.
So what is the consensus? Multiple enforcement actions per constraint?
I'm getting a sense that that is non-controversial, that having multiple enforcement actions is good.
What would those be? Like deny, dry run? So it's like an array.
But if you think about it, deny, and dry run and warning are conflicting. So if you provide both deny and warning, for example, they don't belong together.
Yeah, you also cannot do some of them, right?
They're opposite of each other.
That's the deny and warning, for example. Deny is already a warning.
So there's a couple of things there. One, they don't like break. They just like don't make sense to use together, right? Like you could deny and warn. You're just not going to get any extra from it. But I think also with enforcement points, the notion that the set of enforcement actions is known and finite is not accurate, right? So, for example, if you had shift left, what's something you could do? Okay. And let's take the message queue example, right? Let's say Gator test, it's easier for us to write the push out to queue thing, right? So that one gets the send a message first, right? But Gator doesn't recognize it. Then the Gator test enforcement points has a superset of enforcement actions as a Gator. Does that kind of make sense? I could probably come up with a better example.
I think we're at time, however, sorry. I don't think we can solve this in the next few minutes. So should we start a doc and discuss in the doc? Who wants to drive this?
I can take this one. Or
Okay.
Somebody else.
Okay. So yeah, so start a doc and then we can just add our comments to the doc, and then hopefully let's add this item to next week's agenda so that we can keep talking about it. I think there's a lot of moving pieces, so we're not going to finish in the next few minutes.
Yeah, it'd be good to like lay out the user stories that we would want to,
For sure,
whatever proposals onto.
Yep.
So I think there'd be one namespace exclusion or like audit and stuff, and then see whatever it can give us.
Yep. Yeah. So let's add these to the doc. Right. Okay. Good to see everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.